we're going to have another panel discussion now, and of course, we all know money makes the world go round. So now we're going to look at financing new climate technologies. And so I'm going to make my way over to our area to have this discussion, just in time for my chair. Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to ask Keith Tuffley, who's the Global Co-Head of Citi Sustainability and Corporate Transitions Group, to join me here on stage. Keith. Also joining us, we have Allison Fleming, a senior member of JP Morgan Chase's Green Economy Banking team. Eli Mitchell-Larson is a researcher at Oxford and launch director at Carbon Gap, which is a leading non-profit. And Dominique Barber is a spokesperson for Carbonplace, which is working on a way to transfer carbon credits. I can't wait to get into that. Thank you, Dominique. Okay, welcome to you all. We're going to talk about financing new technology. Maybe I can start with just a reasonably easy question, I hope. What are all your perspectives on how important financing into carbon dioxide removal is?
Well, I think we've heard the answer to that, haven't we, Hannah? I mean, I think that the presentation that Johan gave was just compelling. The numbers speak for themselves. We've got in the order of 400 gigatons of budget left to achieve a 1.5-degree world with a 66% chance of success. That's too low for me in terms of chances of success. I'd rather it be a higher chance. And we're currently emitting about 59 gigatons of CO2e per annum. That gives us in the order of 7.5 years before we completely blow the 1.5-degree budget, so that trajectory. So under any of these circumstances, we need to have CDR, we need to have it at real scale, and we need to your question, drive finance as a key part of the supply chain and the value chain.
I made a flippant comment actually before the break that financing was just as important as technology. Would you agree with that? Is it, Allison?
Oh.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So on the financing side, I think you'll hear a lot of stats from the financial people up here. We've heard a lot of stats today. There are a couple of reports out there. Boston Consulting Group and the Global Financial Markets Association did a report in December 2020 saying that $100 to $150 trillion need to be mobilized to facilitate the carbon transition. McKinsey upped it to $275 trillion this year in a report. And so I think, yes, there is a lot of capital facilitation that needs to occur, and that's something that we're all spending a lot of time on.
And Eli, from your perspective as a researcher and your experience at Carbon Gap, how important is finance?
Well, I guess as the only non-banker investor up here, I'll try to take the question a little bit bigger and say that, for every carbon removal method, and, at Carbon Gap, for us, that's everything. It's not just, the 4 prime flavors of direct air capture. It's also planting kelp forests and restoring soils. So for every carbon removal solution, it goes through an evolution, during which time, and we heard about this in the previous panels, it needs different kinds of finance and money. And really, that money is the sort of sustenance that keeps that carbon removal method alive. So we're hosted by Climeworks, but they've been on a multiple-decade journey. So over the course of that journey, I'm sure they got grants from governments, they got donations from private philanthropists, they got all kinds of different forms of financing, and only today are they ready for project financing. So we'll get into the details in this panel on, what do you all need to make a commercial project finance investment in a direct air capture plant, for example. But I just want to also have us all hold in our heads and hearts the idea that, there's so many carbon removal methods, they're all needed, they're at different stages, and although we will probably be narrowly talking about ROI as, financial return on investment, the big return on investment here is the impact and the kind of binary existential question of, will we stop climate change? So we'll have to be more expansive about the investment that we'll be making as a society, not just under the constraints that these institutions have to operate within.
But there is a lot of demand there.
First of all, I wanted to thank Climeworks for today. And I think one thing that has come out as part of the lens that I'm going to be bringing today through financing is collaboration. And so I see there's competitors in the room, there's different areas, there's policymakers. So this is a fantastic forum, so thank you very much. Just in terms of financing, part of what we need is infrastructure. And so that's the lens that I'm going to be talking about today in the carbon markets. Carbon markets, extremely important, but we need to remove the friction, and we need to build robust infrastructure. And so I'll talk a little bit about Carbonplace, which we consider robust infrastructure that will be future-proofed in order to really scale the carbon markets, particularly carbon removal.
All right, well, we talked a little bit about how it's kind of horses for courses. There's lots of different parts to carbon capture. There's lots of different elements to the financing side of things, as you explained, Eli. We all know here, I mean, we're preaching to the choir that direct air capture is essential. We understand that in this room. But I asked this earlier, do financiers understand that, Dominique?
Well, I'm going to talk about the difference between being involved and being committed. And you're never going to forget this when I talk about this, because it's about bacon and eggs. I'm going to compare it to bacon and eggs. So in bacon and eggs, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. And so we really need commitment. We talked, and we're hearing a lot of talk today. And so one of the things that's really important is commitment, and commitment from the finance community. And I think that's what we're going to try to bring as part of Carbonplace.
Mm-hmm. And banks, Allison, what will it take for banks to kind of step up?
So I think a number of banks, and I say this having worked for a couple of banks in the sustainability space now, I think a number of banks are very much aware of how much capital needs to be scaled to direct air capture, to removals. And so I really do believe that banks are trying to figure out how to be involved in this space. It's challenging because at the end of the day, banks do have limitations on how their capital can be deployed. And so what we really need to do is think about how can we leverage solutions and creative structures that we've used in other scenarios to facilitate that debt-like or bank-like capital structure. So, banks in the past have been very much involved in structuring tranches, different tranches of capital. So can we figure out ways to leverage either concessionary capital, blended capital, first loss capital, to be able to facilitate more bank debt, more project finance to even earlier stage projects?
And Keith, what about your perspective from Citi?
Well, look, I mean, there's multiple roles that banks, global banks play in this whole equation. We are lenders. In fact, you've got 2, if not 3 of the largest lenders in the world through the energy sector on stage here. We are facilitators. We help match companies' needs to the capital markets, whether that's equity or debt or hybrid, convertible. And we advise. We support companies in helping them to shift their business models from brown to green. And we help emerging, fantastically exciting technologies like Climeworks and others in the room today to get access to that capital. So there's multiple roles that we can play. I think one of the roles that I'm sure all of us on stage play is to help the bankers who don't often have the advantage of the presentation that Johan Rockström gave today, day to day. I mean, this is the stuff that we talk all the time about, right? We're always nodding. Whereas we have to recognise many bankers haven't grown up with this. That sounds bad. They haven't lived this. And so it's our responsibility to make sure they know it, they understand it. We are facing a massive 3-way clash for land and ocean on the planet. We've got the emerging issue of obviously growing population. We're at 7.9 billion today, going to 10 billion people. That requires more calories. Right? We need more land for food. That's why we need a food revolution, because we need to transform the way that we produce the food. We've got a nature and biodiversity crisis. We actually need more land to restore nature and biodiversity in the world. And the other emerging one that's coming is biofuels. The aviation sector has promised now to decarbonise to net zero by 2050, but 60 or 70% of that, they say, is coming from biofuels. That's an increase in land demand for that production. So One of the great things that's not factored into the equation for direct air capture is that it's very land efficient. That's something that I think Christoph pointed out earlier on. It's not requiring a lot of land, provided you've got the renewable energy and the geological features to store it permanently. And those aspects are not factored into the investor perspectives, the advantages and the appeal, the long-term appeal of the sector.
Why is that then?
Well, as I said, look, we're all learning, right? No one knows everything. I think people like Gabrielle who are able to stand up and advocate this into investors. It's part of the learning experience. And look, it's on the way. There's no doubt. I mean, the $600 million capital raise, 600 million franc capital raise that Climeworks conducted with the assistance of JP Morgan, and Citi had the great privilege of advising GIC on that transaction, is evidence. It's on its way. But we have to go much faster. Much faster.
I was about to say, because the clock's ticking, right, Eli?
Indeed it is, yeah. And I think, although this is the financing panel, I can't help myself, because Carbon Gap, of course, we're a policy advocacy org, and I think the key piece here to actually get us to a point where these organizations can, on a sustainable basis, put in capital, get an ROI, is policy, right? And I think specifically, public policy governs how pretty much all the funds involved in carbon removal flow. Everything from, products that make carbon neutral or net zero claims to the consumer, well, advertising regulators need to step in, right? But just to maybe focus in on one that's very tied to the project finance question, it's deployment incentives. And we heard some amazing words in the last panel about, how did solar and wind get cheap? And I want to make the case even stronger for why carbon removal, particularly high durability carbon removal solutions like what Climeworks offers and others that require large infrastructure, why this public deployment incentive is even more important than in the solar and the wind case. Because the analogy only extends so far. Solar and wind produce electrons. They produce a good that people already want to buy at a price that we know what it is. CO2, not so much. It's a public good. So there's no necessarily light at the end of the tunnel. And I think when you look at what we're relying on today, we have this amazing vanguard from Frontier, from NextGen, from South Pole, all these demand aggregation efforts that take corporate voluntary buyers, pool their commitments together, and then contract with carbon removal providers. Amazing. Like, we're so thrilled to see that happening. But that's relying on a somewhat fragile type of demand, which is voluntary corporate will to buy these credits. What happens in a global financial crisis? What happens if there's a war? Any number of things can happen where the first thing that might get cut is a corporate's goodwill to buy really expensive carbon credits. So it goes by many names, but you know it when you see it. A fixed price for long contract, high credit-worthy off-taker. If you have that, then my colleagues on the stage will be thrilled to invest in your project. And that can come from a deployment incentive from government. The Germans did it with the feed-in tariff. The UK did it with the contract for difference. The US had their tax credit. Many names, but we need that deployment incentive. We need it. And so we're really thrilled to see that in the EU Sustainable Carbon Cycles communication, they've actually put a flag in the ground and said, we're going to try for a contract for difference for carbon removal. So we need to push them and make sure that that actually happens, because that's going to be the lifeblood that makes high durability carbon removal viable for commercial project finance investment.
I see Allison, Dominique, you're both nodding furiously in agreement with that. I mean, is that the biggest hurdle then for financiers to get into this market?
Absolutely. I think the way Eli described it is exactly right. I did solar project development, and we always use the term, it was used earlier, bankability. By having those contract for differences, you absolutely add bankability. It makes it easier to lend, and over time, the banks get more comfortable with the technology risk, which then means that they can increase the loan to value, so the amount that they're actually lending. So absolutely important for what we call bankability.
Yeah, and I just add to that, an important part of that equation is the technology and decreasing the technology risk over time to increase the bankability over time. I know we've had a lot of conversations, I've had a lot of conversations with folks here who maybe are in an earlier stage of development, and it really is important from a bank's perspective to be bankable, that technology has been at least rolled out at commercial scale initially to drive down the technology risk to the bank.
Alison, how has financing into direct air capture kind of evolved over time? Are you starting to see more interest in this, or?
Well, so certainly from an equity perspective, and I think Climeworks has an amazing example from this past spring and the $650 million raise. I mean, the appetite and interest there from a number of investors, whether they actually ended up investing or not, was astounding. I mean, I don't want to say astounding, but it was really, truly amazing just how many investors were coming in, really engaging with the technology, with the need for removals, with the possibility around the total addressable market for removals overall, for carbon dioxide removal specifically, or sorry, direct air capture removal specifically. And I would say from an equity perspective, equity investors' perspective, we're certainly seeing a lot of interest. And this just really gets banks and debt investors like ourselves excited about the possibility for scaling up, for leveraging up those investments that a number of equity players are out there making.
Keith, I'll come back to you on companies in just a moment, but Dominique, maybe first of all, can you explain why Carbonplace is needed? Because you guys are doing something slightly different when it comes to financing.
Yeah, so maybe I should just start by defining what Carbonplace is. It's a global transaction network that allows for the simple, transparent, and secure settlement, cash settlement, and retirement of carbon credits. It was founded by 4 banks, CIBC, Itaú, NatWest, National Australia Bank, and we've recently added 4 others, UBS, Standard Chartered, Sumitomo Mitsui, and UBS. And UBS. And most important, we're in Switzerland, and we're actually about to announce another one. Will be announced in the next day or two. And the reason here, we want to scale the markets. We want to build robust infrastructure. We're not talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands of credits. We're talking about, and not even millions of credits, but we need to get to hundreds of millions and billions of credits. So in order to do that, we need robust infrastructure. And today, the carbon markets, the way we see it, we see some problems, for example, with bilateral contracts. These take a lot of time to negotiate. They create friction and drag in the market. And there's some simple things that the banks do that is a really important component to scale the markets. What we do best is what we call KYC and AML, Know Your Client, and anti-money laundering. These are not super exciting elements of a carbon market, but they're critical. If we're going to make this into a very scaled or huge billions of credits of market, we need that very robust infrastructure. So it's using distributed ledger technology, blockchain technology, which will track individual projects, and we expect that this is going to future-proof the market.
So how significant then is this in helping companies scale their technology?
Oh, it's critical. It's critical because we have over 100 million clients that we've onboarded through the KYC and AML. So it's a distribution network. So as we're building, some people have called this the SWIFT of the carbon markets. So it's a payment system. Some have called it a roadmap, so it's a way to scale. And really personally, I think about this as critical infrastructure. We talked about roads, but it's like an electrical grid that creates an ability for carbon credits to go into the hands of millions of customers. And that's going to be necessary if we are to scale this to the billions number that is needed.
Eli, what do you think about this idea of carbon credits as a way to facilitate scaling?
I think it's the voluntary carbon market has been a tried and true way to, conduct what's ultimately a two-way transaction. On one side, you get money going to something good, and on the other side, someone gets to make a claim. And that's been very powerful for financing a lot of different things, but I want to sort of also, because we're not here just to talk about direct air capture. There's a whole panoply of other carbon removal methods. And I want to highlight that there are other ways, so very supportive of this particular pathway, and we do need DLTs to kind of bridge the meat space and the digital record of who owns the carbon credits and when they've been retired. But there are a lot of other ways to bring money to promising carbon removal projects. And I think sometimes carbon credits, because they allow this neutralization claim to be made by a company, are not always the best solution. So particularly for those carbon removal methods that we don't have as high a certainty as you might from a Climeworks plant. We can use public funds. We can do things like conservation easements to protect land. There's a whole list of ways that we can bring money to these projects without letting a fossil fuel emitter off the hook on the other side of that transaction. So just to say that let's stay open to those methods as well, and let's scale them alongside the scale of the voluntary carbon market.
And Keith, what is your kind of position then from a company point of view?
Well, look, I think from a company perspective, we need to recognise that that all of us are in this systemic challenge that we face. So all companies, no matter whether they're large emitting, they're all part of this systemic challenge. I mean, there's going to be just many companies whose business models will be fundamentally impacted by ongoing climate change, but also by the need for them to be contributing. For example, the technology companies, consumer companies, customer-facing, consumer-facing companies. They've all got a role to play some way. So I think firstly it's a way to recognise that in the case of direct air capture, but also other forms of CDR, and the point was made earlier on, there are different quality levels. And it's really important to recognise that. Back to my point about the use of land. Those technologies that don't need a lot of land, all other things being equal, should have higher quality, should have high value for the carbon dioxide that they remove. All other things being equal. But there's other things others play, for example, social elements that are critical to our global transition as well. So every major company should recognise that direct air capture and other forms of CDR will be critical to our future. They have to think about what role can we play to support it. So I want to pay credit, for example, to a company like Stripe and others in the consortium with Frontier. It's a very creative way to get the whole system, to get the whole market to be developed. The next gen collaboration as well. So thinking through the system, what each company can contribute to that system, and how we can ensure that it is in all of our interests to scale up this sector as quickly as possible and as cost effectively as possible. There's no one answer for each company, but every company has some role to play to ensure they're participating to help scale this technology. And keeping in mind, this is, it's virtually, direct air capture can be put virtually anywhere in the world. Of course, the storage is different because you need a storage, either a geological feature or the geographical aspects to store it permanently. But it's doable effectively anywhere. So it's recognising the role that each company can play to contribute to the systemic solution.
Can I just kind of almost sidestep to finance and policy, Eli? What is the relationship there? Is there an intersection?
Massively so, because at each stage of the evolution of the carbon removal method, you need that sustenance, as I was saying. So I think one thing that one thing that's really interesting to see is how different governments are approaching this problem. So in the US, it so happens that they're doing lots of things, including starting to provide some guidance around certification through the Department of Energy. But they've really got this hallmark $3.5 billion deployment into carbon transport and storage. So that was what was possible in that political environment. And so they're starting with the underlying transport and storage infrastructure. In the UK, they've deployed £100 million to support kind of early to mid-stage carbon removal methods and get them to that next stage, and they're looking to do much more. So they're maybe more focused at that kind of earlier stage of the carbon removal life cycle. And then, of course, in the EU, we just heard from Christian Holzleitner at the Commission, where they're focused on starting from the bottom, the carbon removal certification mechanism upon which every other policy can be built. So different governments are trying different things to help facilitate the flow of capital into these solutions. And the one that's maybe missing is, the rest of the world. Like, a lot of these projects are going to be deployed, obviously, outside of Europe, outside of North America. So we do need to start to create channels to make sure that those regions have a pretty big voice in developing the methodologies and all these things. But I'll close with one idea, because you were talking about the need to help de-risk those early investments. So here's a way that policy can directly catalyze these first investments. Something like a first loss reserve, or a kind of someone to take the hit first. And private philanthropists And governments have done this many times in the past, right? Where, initially with solar project finance, people were getting 20% returns. But even then, it still wasn't appealing enough. There still was too much perceived technology risk. And so if someone steps in, a government or a philanthropist, and says, if something goes wrong within this portfolio, we'll take the hit. That's exactly the kind of risk the public should be taking. Because again, the return on investment we're looking for is a suite of methods that help us avert climate disaster. That's worth a lot. So I think our government should be willing to step up and help provide that pool of funds that can grease the wheels a little bit and let those first-of-a-kind projects be deployed. And I think as soon as these folks have made the first project finance deployments, others will follow very quickly. But that's a tried-and-true strategy.
But until then, Allison, how can we accelerate or increase investment into CDR?
Well, until government steps in and gives away money or makes it first loss, certainly other parties. That's the way that we think of some of the opportunities. You think about Frontier and the great work that they've done there to put $1 billion or nearly $1 billion to work. What if we were able to leverage that? What if we were able to put debt on the back of that somehow? And I'm using that as an example, but I would say for any investors out there who are thinking about how can I get more bang for my buck to scale CDRs, to scale direct air capture, to scale any other climate tech technology that's in the early stages now, come talk to a bank. Talk to a bank about what kind of structures we can put in place with your capital as first loss capital so that we can take that $1 billion and make it $15 billion or $10 billion that go into climate tech development.
I keep thinking that we're often saying throughout today, oh, we're almost there. We just need this little bit to happen, and we need this little bit to happen. And what does the future look like for financing of CDR, Dominique? And what kind of time frame are we talking about?
I think, as Allison said, I think it can happen very quickly, as Allison alluded to, and it just takes a bit of courage. And again, I come back to that commitment versus involved comment, and I think it's really important if you're committed to actually do something. And I think it does, unfortunately, need to come from government first.
Why are we not committed?
Well, I don't know. I'm personally committed. The way I met Christoph, I told him about how my kids bought me Climeworks carbon credits for my birthday. And that's like a cool fact. For me, that was something really.
Mine have only just stopped eating Nutella, that's it.
But I don't know. I think there's an education element, and I think there's a pressure element and it's happening from investors, from NGOs. And so we need transparency is going to be key. I think that will be important.
Keith?
Yeah, I do agree with that. We all know that policy is critical, right? It's a level playing field. It's incentivizing a new sector. Everyone in the room here is trying to create a completely new sector, a completely new system, right? It's new. This is all new. It's fantastic that we're all part of it, and that requires government to kickstart it. We still have $400 billion of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry every year globally. Right? It's painful to say that, but it's also painful to take that away quickly because millions of farmers who rely on diesel subsidies will be, decimated. So it's easy to say it's insane, but it's also very hard to change it. So we've got to recognise that government policy does have to shift. We in the private sector have a major role to play to encourage governments to bring in good policy. I was fortunate enough to run an NGO out of the banking system for a while and running an NGO, and that was a key part of what we were doing was to encourage the good companies to get on stage and get behind the politicians to encourage them to change the policies because the politicians would say they were hearing more from those companies that didn't want the change. So giving the courage for those companies, like everyone in the room, to be promoting good policy, that's critical. I give a lot of credit to the private sector to start initiatives that's got nothing to do with government. GFANZ, I'm sure all of you heard about this whole concept of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is entirely driven by the private sector. Finally, the financiers, investors, asset owners, asset managers, banks, insurance companies, etc., have come together to commit to not only net zero by 2050 in our financing activities, but to get on a 1.5 degree trajectory, i.e. 2030 is the new 2050, right? It's 45% by 2030. And we've all committed to that in our financing activities. Now that's all driven by the private sector. That's not government saying what we have to do. But it's taken us a while to get there, right? Paris Agreement was 2015. It's taken us, 6 years, 5 years to finally say as a group of investors and banks, that's what we're committing to. But it's going to have a real shift because it will drive, we have to measure our emissions embedded in our financing activities, and that will drive the flow of capital away from high-emitting products and services and companies, encourage them to shift brown to green, but also to help facilitate the flow of capital to those companies in the room today.
All right, well, in fact, let's open the floor then to questions. Please do raise your hand if you have a question. I can see somebody already at the front. That would be great. And if you're joining us online, you just need to write the question in the Q&A box on the platform, and then we can take your question. In fact, I have to go and get my phone from over there to read the questions out, so bear with me. And while I do that, please ask your question.
Yes, hello, Matthias Honeck with Perspectives here. Thanks a lot. In earlier sessions, we heard a lot about this need for standardization, also in context of the move towards policy and also starting now with voluntary carbon markets. My question is, from your standpoint, what can right now voluntary carbon markets do in support a transition perhaps in the medium term? Because we also heard from Christian Holzleitner that policy is difficult, it takes time, and it's probably taking too much time for our liking, let's say. Thanks.
I'm glad to jump in. I think most of the progress that's being made right now is on a voluntary basis. I don't know if anyone in policy would have a different opinion on that, but certainly voluntarily the investors that are committing to the principles for responsible investment, the companies that are committing to net zero, or banks committing to net zero banking alliance. I think is that the UN has a net zero tracker, the Race to Zero. A year ago, I'd written down the numbers. There were 1,700 companies that had committed to net zero according to the UN Race to Zero tracker. This year, same time, April of this year, it was up to 5,500. So these voluntary actions that companies, that investors, that stakeholders, shareholders in companies are taking have been immensely important in driving forward awareness of the need for decarbonization and in, I think, driving activities of corporates and investors towards investing in decarbonization.
Please, Dominique.
If I could just add, just in terms of that concept of standardization, which is really key if we're going to scale something. And one of the things that we've got a standardized contract for anyone who participates on our platform. That's key, because right now it's bilateral contracts, takes a lot of time. So that's key. But another aspect of standardization would be on the carbon credit definition itself. And so the data that's required being as crystal clear as possible as to what makes a carbon credit a carbon credit. That continues to evolve. I wish it would evolve more quickly, particularly in direct air capture, for example, where those standards do not currently exist. But that is clearly a challenge.
Thank you.
Super
Eli,
quick addition, if that's okay.
Yes, please do, of
Just
course.
a kind of plea to the voluntary carbon market, because I think it is true that the CRCM will not be ready for a few years now, right? We've got the expert group, and it'll take a while. So the voluntary carbon market will lap the compliance regimes that will define this. But although I think the standardization around contracting and all the kind of mechanics of transacting, really important. The most important thing is the credibility of the carbon credit and the structure around how you define what is and it's not just good and bad, it's a spectrum, right? There's a probability of carbon benefit and it's continuous. So we need ultimately non-conflicted parties to be setting those rules, right? The scientific community with some input from market participants. But the central flaw of the voluntary carbon market for the past 20 years has been that, for all its good intentions, the people setting the rules, it's the students marking their own homework. And if we let that happen again, so I think the voluntary carbon market is doing great. We've got Puro, C-Capsule, CCS+, all these really exciting initiatives that are building methodologies, many of which can probably just be adopted wholesale by some governments. But they have to be ready to sort of police the bad actors that are going to emerge and to step back when it's time to let governments be the ones that defend the public interest, define what this is, the same way we define what a barrel of WTI crude is. And if you don't follow the rules, you get sued. It needs to be the same for carbon credits eventually. So I hope that wasn't too strident, but that's my kind of challenge to the VCM.
Very briefly.
At the risk of piling in, just a very quick comment. I mean, green hydrogen, for example, has just, through the Green Hydrogen Organisation, has just defined exactly what, self-defined, again, no government input, self-defined what green hydrogen is, because, of course, there's a whole issue around green versus blue versus purple, etc. That's what we need. Very clear standards. And by the way, there's also, quite separately to this, a whole trend towards pricing externalities, whether it's the Harvard University initiative, it's Ronald Cohen, etc. It's Emmanuel Faber. It's to try and price these so they get a true value rather than just at the moment, it's, as you've pointed out, it's bland.
A comprehensive answer there, thank you. We have a question over here in the middle.
Is it on? Oh.
Yes.
Thank you. Ava Pernaud from Clean Air Task Force. I have a question primarily for the finance people on the panel. We've heard a lot in this session about financing or creating financial infrastructure. I was just wondering if you're as interested about actually funding, actual infrastructure, right? CO2 pipelines, storage sites. We're way behind in actually developing these, specifically the storage sites, and we're going to need that if you're going to get to gigaton scale direct air capture. So I was just wondering maybe if you could speak a bit about your activities in this space. Thank you.
Okay, let's start.
Keith, please go ahead.
You're right. Again, back to my point about the whole system. We have to get the whole system working at basically the same pace for the whole system. We recognise this is a race. It's a fast race to zero. We recognise the need for us to be driving capital to, recognising all points across that value chain. But the point's also made is you need different financial structures depending on the nature of the asset or the nature of the business. And that's where the creativity of the financial system does have to be also be accelerated. Right? There's a lot more creativity that we have to drive. I'd have to say that there's a separate trend also to greater intentionality with banks, with investors, meaning we're putting a much greater sense of purpose. What are we trying to do here? It's to decarbonise the world, is to create a nature-positive world, and is also to try and reduce global inequalities. The reality is we're not going to achieve the first two without also addressing the third social element. And that, I know it's a very broad answer to your question, but that intentionality mixed with creativity is all you have to do to ensure that all aspects of the value chain are appropriately financed.
And maybe just a follow-up question online that, much of the finance is going into technology development. Is it not now time to design project finance programs with direct air capture, joining up with CCS programs and things?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yes, so much of the finance is going into technology development. Is it not the time now to design project finance programs with direct air capture, joining up with CCS programs?
Joining up with CCS programs.
Yeah.
We would be delighted to like, I think all of us on the panel, I think what they're talking about is growing the project finance area in direct air capture. But again, it comes back to creating carbon as a management, as an entire new industry, carbon removal. And for that, we need robust, carbon pricing, ideally all the stuff that Eli spoke about related to policy, all the stuff that Allison spoke about with regards to net zero and all these buyers, because that then creates, reduces the amount of risk that we take on the project finance side in order to lend the money. I think that's, I don't know if you have anything to add.
And I think it goes back to what Eli said earlier. Long-term, fixed-price offtakes from high credit quality offtakers.
Bankability.
That facilitates project finance, that facilitates bankability.
Yeah, we have a question on the right-hand side of the room. Please stand up.
Yes, I just received a push notification from BBC saying that the Supreme Court will somewhat limit Biden's intention to cut emissions. And I just wonder, where does this discrepancy come from for what should be done and what is actually going on, and how you want to deal with that?
Wow. Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, look, we could spend hours talking about this one, couldn't we? I think I'll make one comment on that, and that is that unless we bring people along on the journey, communicate honestly, we won't get anywhere, right? Now, we're going to get pushback from certain communities. There's going to be some people in the world who are much more sensitive to energy prices than many people in this room. And by the way, food prices as well. Yeah. So we have to recognise that we have to bring these communities on, otherwise we're going to get political backlash, which will be reflected in legislative backlash or even Supreme Court or, legal backlash.
I mean, I realise that you're not going to please everybody, 100% of the people 100% of the time, but when someone like, the US Supreme Court has these decisions and makes these decisions, this is clearly a major issue for the industry.
It's a voting issue. So the Supreme Court is representation of the people. There's a great podcast by The Daily that talks about the EPA, and partly it's because the regulation wasn't written correctly. So the main takeaway here is that we really need to engage particularly our young people to vote, to give governments the wherewithal and the tools that they need and the confidence to move forward aggressively on creating some of these regulations.
Eli?
Right.
I thought no?
Well, as another North American on the panel, I will make no comment on the question, but I love the question because it is about this political mandate piece. And today, I noticed there was SWP, the Swiss Public Radio, and Deutschlandfunk were here. So I love that, radio stations who are, broadcasting content to people driving their cars to and from work are learning about carbon removal. So that is really the key, is, building political will for this. Whether it's among farmer groups or industry associations or everyday people, whatever it is, we need to get more people to feel like this is something that has to happen. And then these kinds of decisions, which I would argue whether the Supreme Court is a representative of the people.
It's supposed to be.
It once was, maybe. But so I think we have to do what we can to get so much political will behind this that the politicians will have to take action.
Okay, I want to end on another tough question. It's coming from online. Why are financial actors so keen to invest in CDR, but so adverse to divest from fossil fuels? I mean, this is what we're seeing right now with the war in Ukraine, that, people are investing in oil and gas.
Can I take that? It's a massive opportunity, and Dr. Friedman, who I know is on the audience, talks about, there's 1.6 trillion tons in the atmosphere today that we need to remove in order to redo the past, which we talked about going back in the past in the time machine. It's a massive opportunity on that side, but there's the concept of the just transition. We can't leave people behind, and so it's not an on-off switch. We do need to be responsible from a social perspective.
It's a great answer. It's a really good question, and a simple answer: we have to transition. We can't just cut. I know for some people that's uncomfortable because they think it's an excuse not to act. Mm-hmm. That's why GFANZ has been put in place, because it's commitment, it's transition, it's working with the real economy and those companies to get a move on and to support their transition. Now, that will only be proven as banks are doing that and with the clients. But it is a very fair question, but we all have to, as a full finance sector, accelerate the transition for these companies.
All right, well, we've run out of time. You'll be pleased to hear. So thank you very much indeed, Keith, Allison, Eli, and Dominique for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please take a seat back.